The auctioneer's gavel struck wood with a crack that echoed through the dusty Sacramento meeting hall, and Josephine Darrow realized her entire future had just been decided by a room full of strangers who believed her red hair made her cursed. She stood frozen at the edge of the gathering, her copper locks tucked beneath a borrowed bonnet, listening as Mrs. Henderson proclaimed to anyone within earshot that no respectable man would take a red-headed wife, that such women brought nothing but trouble and hardship to their households. The words stung like nettles against bare skin, but Josephine had heard variations of this judgment her entire 22 years, ever since her mother died bringing her into this world in 1868, leaving behind only whispered warnings about the misfortune that followed the Darrow women and their distinctive flame-colored hair. Sacramento in 1890 bustled with possibility for some, but Josephine had discovered it held nothing but closed doors for her. She had arrived 3 months earlier from Missouri, hoping the West would prove more forgiving than the small farming community, where she had grown up under the disapproving stares of neighbors who crossed themselves when she passed. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving her with nothing but debts and the realization that she needed to forge her own path. California had seemed like the answer, a place where fortunes changed overnight and people reinvented themselves daily. Instead, she found the same prejudices wearing different faces, the same narrow-minded beliefs dressed in finer clothing. The position she had applied for as a governess went to a woman with mousy brown hair and half her qualifications. The seamstress shop turned her away despite her skilled needlework. Even the boarding house had hesitated before accepting her coin, the proprietress muttering about hoping she would not bring calamity upon the establishment. Josephine had learned to keep her head covered, to make herself small and unremarkable, but it never seemed enough. The whispers followed her like shadows, and now Mrs. Henderson's pronouncement felt like the final nail in a coffin she had been building around herself her entire life. She needed to leave Sacramento. The city pressed in on her with its judgment and cramped streets, its society women who looked down their noses at anyone who did not fit their narrow definition of acceptable. Josephine had heard stories about the smaller settlements scattered throughout California's wilderness, places where hard work mattered more than appearances, where the rough edges of frontier life smoothed away the sharp judgments of polite society. Calistoga had caught her attention during a conversation at the general store, a town nestled in a valley north of San Francisco where hot springs bubbled from the earth, and the mountains stood like sentinels against the sky. It sounded remote enough to offer escape, settled enough to provide opportunity. With her meager savings converted to supplies and a stage-coach ticket, Josephine departed Sacramento on a Thursday morning when fog still clung to the wooden sidewalks. The journey north took 2 days, the coach rattling over rutted roads that carved through golden hills dotted with oak trees. Her fellow passengers included a merchant returning home with goods from the city, a young couple heading to start a farm, and an older woman who kept eyeing Josephine's hair with undisguised suspicion, despite the bonnet. Josephine kept her gaze fixed on the landscape rolling past the window, watching as civilization gradually gave way to wilder country where the hand of man had touched more lightly. Calistoga announced itself with a plume of steam rising from the earth, the hot springs that had drawn settlers to this valley in the shadow of Mount St. Helena. The town had grown up around these thermal waters, a collection of wooden buildings lining a main street that turned to mud when it rained. She could see the mountains rising in every direction, their slopes thick with pine and oak, their peaks touching the sky. The stagecoach deposited her outside a hotel that advertised therapeutic baths, and Josephine stood on the wooden walkway with her trunk and carpet bag, breathing in air that smelled of sulfur and pine and possibility. The hotel clerk, a man with kind eyes and silver hair, did not seem troubled by her appearance. He offered her a room at a reasonable weekly rate and suggested she speak with Mr. Patterson at the general store about employment opportunities. Calistoga needed workers, he explained, people willing to labor hard in exchange for a fresh start. The hot springs attracted visitors seeking cures for various ailments, and the surrounding wilderness yielded timber and game for those brave enough to venture into it. It was a town balanced between civilization and the wild, and Josephine felt something loosen in her chest as she climbed the stairs to her modest room. She found work within a week, hired by a widow named Mrs. Callahan, who ran a restaurant that served miners, loggers, and the occasional tourist seeking the healing waters. The pay was modest but fair, and Mrs. Callahan had looked at Josephine's hair and shrugged, saying she cared more about whether a girl could carry hot plates without dropping them than what color topped her head. The restaurant occupied a building near the center of town, its windows facing the main street, its kitchen always filled with the smell of frying meat and baking bread. Josephine worked from dawn until the dinner rush ended, her hands becoming rough from washing dishes and her feet aching from standing on the wooden floors, but she felt more contentment than she had known in years. The people of Calistoga proved less concerned with superstition than those in Sacramento, though she still caught occasional stares and heard whispered comments. The town attracted enough unusual characters, prospectors with wild dreams and entrepreneurs with questionable schemes, that one red-headed woman barely registered as remarkable. She made tentative friendships with other women who worked in the shops and hotels, attended Sunday services at the small church, and began to imagine a future that extended beyond simple survival. Perhaps she could save enough to open her own establishment someday, a bakery or a boarding house, something that would provide independence and security. 3 months after her arrival in Calistoga, the mountain man walked into Mrs. Callahan's restaurant and changed everything Josephine thought she knew about her own story. He filled the doorway like a force of nature, broad shoulders blocking the afternoon light, his height requiring him to duck slightly beneath the frame. She had been wiping down tables after the lunch crowd, her bonnet discarded in the heat of the kitchen, her red hair pinned up in a practical bun that still managed to catch the light streaming through the windows. He stopped just inside the entrance, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Elijah Turner stood well over 6 feet tall, his frame built from years of hauling timber and navigating mountain trails that would break lesser men. His hair hung past his shoulders in dark brown waves that held hints of auburn when the sun struck them, and a beard covered the lower half of his face, neatly trimmed but full enough to mark him as someone who spent little time concerned with town fashions. He wore buckskin clothing that bore the marks of hard use, and a knife hung at his belt alongside other tools of wilderness survival. His hands looked large enough to span the width of a dinner plate, calloused and scarred from work that demanded strength and skill in equal measure. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale blue like ice on a winter stream, studying her with an expression she could not immediately decipher. "You open for dinner yet?" His voice rumbled deep in his chest, the words economical but not unfriendly. Josephine found her own voice after a moment of silence that stretched too long. "Another hour before we start serving the evening meal, but I can get you something if you are hungry now." He moved further into the room with surprising grace for such a large man, settling onto a chair that creaked under his weight. Coffee would be welcome. Been coming down from the high country since dawn, and the trail does not offer much in the way of refreshment. She hurried to the kitchen, pouring coffee from the pot that stayed warm on the stove throughout the day, trying to calm the strange flutter in her chest. Men came through the restaurant constantly, all types and sizes, and she had learned to treat them all with the same professional courtesy that kept interactions brief and uncomplicated. But something about this particular man unsettled her in a way she could not name, a feeling that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a sudden awareness of herself as more than just a woman serving coffee. When she returned with the cup and saucer, he was studying the room with the careful attention of someone used to noting details others might miss. His gaze shifted to her as she approached, and again she saw that intense focus, as though he was seeing past the surface to something beneath. She set the coffee before him, and his hand brushed hers as he reached for it. The contact brief but somehow significant, calloused fingers against her own work-roughened skin. "Thank you." He wrapped both hands around the cup, and she noticed scars crossing his knuckles, the permanent marks of a life lived rough. "You new to Calistoga? I have not seen you before, and I know most folks in town. I arrived a few months back from Sacramento." Josephine wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of the wisps of hair escaping her bun, the flush the kitchen heat had brought to her cheeks. "Started working here in September." He nodded, sipping the coffee, and she thought the conversation had ended. She turned to resume her cleaning, but his voice stopped her. "Your hair." Her shoulders tensed automatically, bracing for the familiar litany of superstitious nonsense, the thinly veiled insults and dire warnings. She faced him again, lifting her chin with the defiant pride that had gotten her through 22 years of judgment. "What about it?" Elijah Turner looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes that transformed his entire face. "Reminds me of autumn up in the mountains when the oak leaves turn, and the sunset catches them just right. Used to spend hours watching that color spread across the hillsides, thinking nothing made by man could ever match that particular kind of beauty." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "I was wrong. Apparently nature found a way to improve on itself." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs and the thoughts from her head. She stared at him, searching for mockery or cruelty in his face, finding only honest appreciation in those pale blue eyes. No one had ever spoken about her hair except to condemn it, to warn her of the misfortune it supposedly heralded, to suggest she cover it or dye it or hide it away from decent society. This stranger, this mountain of a man who looked like he could break trees with his bare hands, had just compared it to autumn fire beauty, had called it an improvement on nature itself. She struggled to form words, her throat tight with emotions she had spent years suppressing. "Most people say it is a curse, that it marks me as trouble." His expression darkened, not with anger at her but at the stupidity of such beliefs. Most people are fools who cannot see past their own narrow thinking, spend enough time in the wilderness to know that nature does not make mistakes. Everything has its purpose, its place. Your hair is no more a curse than the red tail on a hawk or the copper in a sunset sky. Mrs. Callahan emerged from the kitchen at that moment, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Elijah Turner occupying one of her tables. "Elijah, did not expect to see you down from the mountains this early in the season. Usually you stay up in your cabin until the first real snow drives you to civilization." He stood when she approached, his manners more refined than his appearance might suggest. "Had business in town that would not wait, Sarah. Needed to arrange for some supplies to be hauled up before winter sets in proper. Figured I would stop by for a decent meal before heading back. Well, you are always welcome here, you know that, Mrs. Callahan glanced between him and Josephine, and something knowing flickered across her face. I see you have met my newest girl. Josephine has been a blessing, hardest worker I have had in years. Josephine, Elijah here supplies us with game meat when he comes down from the high country. Venison, elk, wild turkey, whatever the mountains provide. Best hunter in 3 counties, though he would never brag about it himself. Josephine felt the weight of new information settling over her understanding of this man. A hunter and trapper, someone who spent most of his time alone in the wilderness, surviving by skill and strength. It explained the self-sufficient air about him, the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin without any need for external validation. She had never met anyone quite like him, and the realization both intrigued and frightened her. The dinner rush began soon after, a flood of hungry men seeking hot food after long days of labor. Josephine threw herself into work, carrying plates and refilling coffee cups, too busy to think about pale blue eyes and unexpected compliments. But she remained aware of Elijah Turner sitting at his table, eating the venison stew Mrs. Callahan prepared specially for him, his presence somehow filling more space than his considerable size alone could account for. He stayed through the evening, nursing coffee and conversing quietly with various townspeople who stopped to greet him, and Josephine felt his gaze on her throughout, a weight that was not uncomfortable but definitely noticeable. When the crowd finally thinned and she began clearing tables, he approached with his empty dishes, meeting her near the kitchen door. Up close, she could see the small details she had missed earlier, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver threads beginning to show in his dark hair, the small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked to be perhaps 30 years old enough to have lived considerable life, but young enough that strength still defined his movement. "I will be in town for a few days," he said, handing her the dishes. "Managing the supply situation, making arrangements for winter. Would you allow me to call on you? Take you walking, maybe show you some of the prettier parts of the valley?" Josephine nearly dropped the plates she held, shocked by the directness of his request. Men had expressed interest before, usually the drunken miners who thought any woman working in a restaurant must be available for other services as well. But no one had ever asked to court her properly, to spend time in her company for the simple pleasure of conversation. The word unmarriageable echoed in her head, Mrs. Henderson's voice declaring with certainty that her red hair made her unsuitable for any respectable man's attention. "Why?" The question emerged before she could stop it, blunt and revealing. "You do not know anything about me. I know you work hard. I know you carry yourself with dignity despite whatever hardships brought you here. I know your hair catches the light like autumn leaves, and when you smile at the customers, it changes your whole face." He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his features. "I know I have not been able to stop thinking about you since I walked through that door, and I would very much like the opportunity to know more." She wanted to say yes with a desperation that frightened her, wanted to grab hold of this unexpected chance with both hands and refuse to let go. But years of rejection and disappointment had taught her caution, had built walls around her heart that did not come down easily. "I have been told my entire life that I would never find a husband, that my appearance marks me as undesirable. People have many superstitions about red hair." Elijah's expression hardened into something fierce and protective. "Then those people are blind idiots who deserve their own narrow misery. I live in the mountains, Josephine. I see beauty every day in 1,000 different forms, and I learned long ago that the things that make something different are usually what make it worth noticing. Please, let me call on you. If you decide you do not enjoy my company, I will accept that and leave you in peace. But give me at least the chance to prove that not every man is a superstitious fool." The intensity of his conviction broke through her defenses, and she found herself nodding before her practical mind could construct objections. "All right, I finish work at 8 most evenings. There is a path behind the hotel where I am staying that leads toward the hot springs. I sometimes walk there before bed." His entire face transformed with his smile, and she caught a glimpse of what he must have looked like as a younger man before the wilderness carved its marks into his features. "I will meet you there tomorrow evening, if that suits you." "Tomorrow evening," she confirmed, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of anticipation and terror. He left soon after, disappearing into the darkness beyond the restaurant's warm light, and Josephine stood holding dirty dishes while her entire world tilted on its axis. Mrs. Callahan emerged from the kitchen, wearing an expression that suggested she had witnessed the entire exchange. "Elijah Turner is a good man," the older woman said, taking the plates from Josephine's unresisting hands. "Keeps to himself mostly, prefers the mountains to town life, but there is not a dishonest bone in his body. Known him for 5 years, since he first started bringing game meat to sell. He could make a fortune as a guide for rich men wanting to hunt, but he values his solitude too much. Never seen him take interest in a woman before, though plenty have tried to catch his eye." Josephine met her employer's knowing gaze. "He said my hair reminded him of autumn in the mountains." "No one has ever said anything like that to me before." "Most people only see what they have been taught to see," Mrs. Callahan said gently. "Elijah Turner makes up his own mind about things. It is one of the reasons he lives up in the wilderness away from society's expectations. If he sees beauty in your red hair, you can trust that he means it with his whole heart." That night, lying in her narrow bed at the hotel, Josephine stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what walking with Elijah Turner might be like. She knew nothing about mountain men or wilderness survival, had spent her entire life in towns and settlements where civilization imposed its rules and structures. What would they even talk about? What could she possibly offer someone who seemed so completely self-contained, who needed nothing from the world except his own skill and strength? The questions chased themselves through her mind until exhaustion finally dragged her into restless sleep. The next day crawled past with excruciating slowness. Every task at the restaurant took twice as long as usual. Every customer seemed to linger endlessly. Every minute stretched into an eternity. She caught herself checking her reflection in the kitchen window, tucking stray hairs back into place, wondering if she had imagined the admiration in Elijah's eyes. Perhaps he would not come. Perhaps he had reconsidered in the clear light of day and decided she was not worth the effort after all. Perhaps this was just another disappointment waiting to crush the fragile hope beginning to bloom in her chest. But when she finished her shift and walked the familiar path behind the hotel, she found him waiting beneath an oak tree, his tall form silhouetted against the twilight sky. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his hair tied back, his buckskin shirt replaced with a simple cotton one that somehow made his shoulders look even broader. He straightened when he saw her approaching, and the smile that crossed his face erased every doubt that had plagued her throughout the day. "I was afraid you might change your mind," she admitted as she drew near, the honesty slipping out before she could dress it in more careful words. "I have been waiting here for an hour," he replied, falling into step beside her as they began walking toward the hot springs. "Could not risk being late and missing you." They walked in silence for a few minutes, adjusting to each other's presence, the path beneath their feet worn smooth by countless visitors seeking the thermal waters. Steam rose in wisps from the springs ahead, ghostly in the gathering darkness, and the smell of sulfur mingled with pine resin on the evening breeze. Josephine noticed how Elijah moved with complete awareness of his surroundings, his attention constantly cataloging details most people would miss. The way a deer trail intersected their path, the distant cry of a hawk settling for the night, the shift in air temperature as they approached the heated springs. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" she asked, breaking the comfortable quiet. 8 years now. Came west from Virginia after the war, spent a few years drifting, trying to figure out where I belonged. Worked as a ranch hand, a logger, a freight driver, but nothing felt right. Too many people, too much noise, too many expectations about who I should be and how I should live. He paused, his gaze distant with memory. Then I spent a winter trapping in the Sierra Nevada, and something just clicked into place. The silence up there, the solitude, the way everything makes sense when you strip away all the unnecessary complications people create. Built my cabin in the spring and never looked back. You ever get lonely? The question emerged soft, vulnerable, and she half regretted asking it. He considered this seriously, not dismissing her concern with easy platitudes. Sometimes. Usually in the evenings when the day's work is done and there is nothing but my own thoughts for company. But I found that I prefer occasional loneliness to constant irritation with people who cannot mind their own business. In the mountains, nobody cares what I do or how I live. Nobody judges me for not fitting into their idea of normal. Josephine understood that sentiment more deeply than he could know. I came west hoping to escape the same thing. Spent my whole life being told I was wrong somehow, that my hair marked me as cursed or dangerous or unmarriageable. Thought maybe California would be different, but people carry their prejudices with them no matter where they go. They had reached the springs, where pools of heated water collected in natural rock formations, steam rising in clouds that obscured the stars beginning to appear overhead. Elijah guided her to a flat boulder that offered a seat above the waterline, its surface still warm from the day's sun. He settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame, distant enough to remain respectful of propriety. "My mother had red hair," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the steaming water. "Brightest copper you ever saw, and my father loved her fiercer than anything else in this world. He used to say she burned brighter than other people, that she felt everything more intensely, loved more completely, fought harder for what mattered. She died when I was 12, fever that the doctor could not break, and my father followed her within a year. I think his heart just gave up without her. The revelation settled between them, heavy with shared understanding. I am sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago. But I never forgot what my father said, how he defended her against anyone who suggested her red hair meant anything except that she was extraordinary. Maybe that is why I see autumn fire beauty instead of superstitious nonsense when I look at you. I know better than to believe that someone's worth comes from how well they blend in with expectations." Josephine felt tears prickling at her eyes, emotions she had kept locked away for years, threatening to overflow. "No one has ever defended me like that. My own father loved me, I think, but he also seemed embarrassed by me, like I was proof of some failing on his part. And my mother died giving birth to me, so I never knew if she would have felt differently." Elijah's hand found hers where it rested on the boulder between them, his fingers curling around hers with surprising gentleness for such a large, rough man. "Their limitations are not your burden to carry. You did not choose your hair color any more than you chose when and where to be born. Anyone who judges you for either is too stupid to deserve your consideration." They sat together as darkness completed its claim on the valley, talking about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing with the easy rhythm of people who recognize something fundamental in each other. He told her about life in the high country, the rhythm of seasons measured in snowfall and game migrations, the satisfaction of providing for himself through his own skill and effort. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the small kindnesses that had sustained her through years of casual cruelty, the dreams she still harbored despite every reason to abandon them. "What kind of dreams?" he asked, his thumb tracing absent patterns across her knuckles. "Foolish ones, probably. I always imagined having a home of my own, a place where I belonged without question, where I could just be myself without constantly bracing for judgment. Maybe a family, if I could find someone who actually wanted me instead of settling for me. A quiet life filled with ordinary happiness. Nothing foolish about that. Sounds like exactly what most people want when you strip away all the noise about money and status and social standing." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "The mountains offer that kind of life. Hard work and isolation in exchange for peace and freedom. Not everyone can handle it, but for those who can, it becomes more valuable than anything civilization promises." They walked back to town later, the path lit by a moon that had risen while they talked, and Elijah left her at the hotel door with a promise to see her again the next evening. Josephine climbed the stairs to her room feeling lighter than she had in years, as though some weight she had carried her entire life had been quietly set aside. She lay in bed with her hand still tingling from his touch, replaying every word of their conversation, testing the strange new hope growing in her heart like a tentative flame. The pattern established itself over the next 3 days. Josephine worked her shift at the restaurant while Elijah managed his business in town, arranging for winter supplies to be hauled to his cabin before the mountain passes became impassable with snow. They met each evening, walking different paths around Calistoga, discovering the valley's hidden corners while discovering each other. He showed her the cave where bats nested in summer, now empty as the creatures had migrated south. She showed him the wild blackberry patch behind the church, where fruit still clung to thorny vines despite the advancing season. They talked until the night grew cold and Josephine shivered despite her shawl, at which point Elijah would shrug out of his coat and drape it over her shoulders, the garment still warm from his body and smelling of pine and leather. On the 4th evening, he arrived at the restaurant just as she finished her shift, his expression serious in a way that made her heart stutter with sudden anxiety. "Walk with me. There is something I need to say, and I would rather do it away from town." She nodded, untying her apron with trembling fingers, following him out into the October night. They walked in silence until they reached a ridge overlooking the valley, where Calistoga spread below them like a scattering of warm lights against the darkness. Elijah stood at the edge, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense with some internal struggle. "I need to head back to the mountains tomorrow," he finally said, his voice rough. "Winter comes early at high elevation, and I have preparations to finish before the first serious snow. If I wait much longer, I will get trapped in town until spring." Josephine had known this moment would come, had braced herself for it during the quiet hours when doubt crept in, but the reality still hit her like a blow to the chest. "I understand. You have responsibilities, a life up there." "I do." He turned to face her, and the moonlight caught the fierce intensity in his pale eyes. "But I also have something here I never expected to find. You asked me earlier this week if I get lonely in the mountains. The truth is, I did not realize how lonely I was until I met you. Now the thought of going back to that cabin alone feels like sentencing myself to a prison of my own making. What are you saying? Her voice emerged barely above a whisper, afraid to hope, terrified to assume. Elijah closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so large and rough. I am saying that I have spent 4 days falling in love with you, Josephine Darrow. I am saying that your red hair is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and your voice is the sound I want to wake up to every morning for the rest of my life. I am saying that if you are willing, I want you to come with me to the mountains. Be my wife. Build a life with me where none of the petty judgments and stupid superstitions can reach us. The world tilted and righted itself, and Josephine found herself standing in a moment that would define the rest of her existence. Every voice that had ever told her she was unmarriageable, every judgment passed on her appearance, every door closed in her face suddenly seemed like steps on a path leading to this exact place, this exact man, this exact question. Elijah Turner looked at her like she was precious beyond measure, like her red hair made her more desirable rather than less, like loving her would be a privilege instead of a burden. I have known you for 4 days, she said, testing the practicalities even as her heart screamed yes. That is hardly enough time to make a decision about marriage. I have known you long enough to see your character. You are kind to people who do not deserve it, patient with fools who test your temper, hardworking even when exhaustion drags at you. You have honest eyes and a strong spine and enough courage to chase a better life, even when the odds were stacked against you. Everything else is just details we can learn together. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, and she realized she was crying. But if you need more time, I will give you all winter to think about it. I can come back down in the spring and ask again. No. The word emerged fierce and certain. I do not need more time to know that I love you too. I do not need more time to know that I want to spend my life with you, wherever that life might be. Yes, Elijah Turner, I will marry you. His kiss tasted like happiness and promise, gentle despite the passion she could feel thrumming through his large frame, his control absolute even as his arms wrapped around her and lifted her feet from the ground. Josephine clung to his shoulders, to the solid reality of muscle and bone and warmth, kissing him back with every ounce of emotion she had suppressed for 22 years. When he finally set her down, they were both breathing hard, and his smile could have lit the entire valley. They married 2 days later in Calistoga's small church, with Mrs. Callahan standing as witness and the minister, who had accepted Josephine into his congregation, without judgment presiding over the brief ceremony. She wore her best dress, simple blue cotton with white lace at the collar, and pinned her red hair up with the ivory comb that had belonged to her mother. Elijah wore clean buckskin, and a new shirt purchased specially for the occasion, his hair tied back, his hands shaking slightly as he slid the plain gold band onto her finger. The ring had belonged to his mother, the only piece of jewelry his father had been able to afford, and Elijah had carried it for 18 years waiting for the right woman to wear it. I promise to protect you, provide for you, and love you until my last breath leaves my body, he said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. I promise to see you, truly see you, every day for the rest of our lives. I promise that your red hair will always remind me how lucky I am to have found something so rare and beautiful. Josephine barely made it through her own vows without dissolving into tears, the words catching in her throat as she looked up at this mountain of a man who had chosen her, who had seen past every reason society offered to reject her, and found only reasons to love her instead. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to build a life with you that honors both of us, to love you with everything I have. I promise to trust your strength and believe in your goodness. I promise that I will never regret saying yes to you, Mrs. Callahan cried openly through the whole ceremony, and afterward she pressed a package of food into their hands for the journey, refusing to accept payment and insisting it was a wedding gift. You take care of her, Elijah Turner, or you will answer to me when you come down for supplies. Yes, madam, he replied with absolute seriousness. I intend to spend every day of my life making sure she knows she made the right choice. They left Calistoga that afternoon, Josephine's few possessions packed onto the mule Elijah had purchased to carry supplies. She rode a gentle mare he had borrowed from a friend, her inexperience with horses requiring the most placid mount available. The trail climbed steadily into the mountains, leaving the valley behind as they ascended into country where pine trees grew thick and the air thinned with elevation. Elijah walked beside her horse, one hand always near the bridle, his attention constantly scanning their surroundings for potential dangers. The mountains revealed themselves in layers of breathtaking beauty. Oak trees wore their autumn colors, gold and orange and deep red, their leaves catching the slanting afternoon light exactly as Elijah had described. Granite outcroppings thrust through the soil like bones of the earth, and water ran in dozens of small streams that would become torrents when winter snow began melting. They saw deer watching from the shadows, squirrels harvesting acorns for winter storage, a red-tailed hawk riding thermal currents above the ridgeline. Everything felt sharper here, more real, as though the wilderness stripped away pretense and left only truth. They camped that first night in a clearing Elijah had used before, where a rock overhang provided shelter and a fire ring spoke of previous travelers. He built the fire with practiced efficiency, establishing warmth and light against the mountain darkness, then set about preparing a simple dinner from their supplies. Josephine tried to help, but her domestic skills did not translate well to outdoor cooking, and she finally stepped back to let him work while she spread their bedrolls near the fire. The awkwardness of wedding night expectations hung in the air between them, unspoken but present. They had shared nothing more than kisses, had known each other barely a week, and now they faced the intimacy of sleeping side by side in the wilderness. Elijah seemed to sense her nervousness, because after they finished eating, he sat beside her on the bedroll and took her hand. "We have all the time in the world," he said quietly. "Nothing has to happen tonight except sleep. I know this is all moving fast, and I do not want you to feel pressured or afraid. You are my wife, and that means I will wait until you are ready for anything more." The knot of anxiety in Josephine's chest loosened. "I am not afraid of you. I just do not want to disappoint you. I do not know anything about being a wife, especially a mountain wife. What if I cannot handle this life? What if I am not strong enough?" Elijah pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her, his warmth and solid strength surrounding her like armor against doubt. "You are stronger than you think. You survived 22 years of people trying to convince you that you were wrong or cursed or unmarriageable, and you kept going anyway. You left everything familiar to chase a better life. You said yes to marrying a man you barely knew and followed him into the wilderness. That takes more courage than most people ever manage." She turned in his embrace, tilting her face up to meet his kiss, losing herself in the heat and tenderness of his mouth against hers. They lay down together on the joined bedrolls, fully clothed, holding each other as the fire burned down to embers, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, the sound both eerie and beautiful, and Josephine felt Elijah's arms tighten around her protectively. "Welcome to the mountains, Mrs. Turner," he murmured against her hair, and she smiled into the darkness, thinking that Unmarriageable had turned out to be just another lie in a lifetime of lies, and the truth was so much better than anything she had imagined. They reached Elijah's cabin late the following afternoon, climbing a final ridge to reveal a clearing where he had built his home against the mountainside. The structure was larger than Josephine had expected, constructed from logs that Elijah had felled and shaped himself, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch running across the front. Glass windows caught the fading sunlight, real glass rather than oiled paper, and the door hung straight and true in its frame. Behind the cabin, a lean-to sheltered firewood stacked in neat rows, enough to last through the hardest winter. A smokehouse stood to one side, and a small barn provided shelter for animals. "It is beautiful," Josephine breathed, sliding down from her horse and turning in a slow circle to take in the view. The clearing sat high enough to offer vistas in 3 directions, mountains rolling away in waves of green and gray and gold, the sky so vast and blue it hurt to look at. "You built all this yourself?" "Took 3 years to get it like I wanted," Elijah said, pride evident in his voice as he began unloading the mule. "Started with just the basic cabin, then added improvements each season. Windows came last year, brought up from Sacramento in pieces and assembled here. Still have plans for more, maybe a root cellar dug into the hillside, expansion on the barn if we decide to keep more livestock." Josephine walked to the cabin door, running her hand over the smooth wood, noting the craftsmanship in every joint and corner. Elijah had carved their initials into the lintel, fresh cuts that exposed pale wood beneath the weathered surface, marking this as their home now instead of his alone. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, stopping just over the threshold as she absorbed the space that would be her new world. The single large room combined living area, kitchen, and bedroom, with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder taking up one corner. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, large enough to heat the entire space and fitted with iron hooks for cooking. A table and chairs occupied the center of the room, clearly handmade but sturdy and well-proportioned. Shelves lined the walls, holding tools and supplies organized with military precision. The bed stood in the opposite corner from the loft, a substantial frame that Elijah had obviously built to accommodate his size, covered with wool blankets and furs that promised warmth through the coldest nights. Everything spoke of a man who had created not just shelter but home, who had taken time and care to make this isolated cabin comfortable rather than merely functional. Josephine felt emotions swelling in her chest, gratitude and wonder and love all tangled together, as she realized that Elijah had brought her to a place he had poured himself into, sharing the most private part of his life without reservation. He came in behind her, carrying the first load of supplies, and stopped when he saw her expression. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Everything is perfect." She crossed to him, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for making me your wife. Thank you for seeing beauty in what everyone else called a curse." They spent the remaining daylight hours settling Josephine's belongings into the cabin, finding spaces for her few dresses and personal items among Elijah's more utilitarian possessions. He cleared half the shelf space for her use, moved his clothes to one side of the bed, created room in his life with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. As darkness fell, he prepared dinner while she watched and tried to learn. Vegetables and salt pork transformed into a hearty stew through methods that looked simple when he did them, but she knew would take practice to master. After they ate, they sat together on the porch wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the stars emerge in impossible numbers across the mountain sky. The silence felt different from town quiet, deeper and more complete, broken only by wind through pine trees and the occasional call of night birds. Josephine leaned against Elijah's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of his body along her side. "Tell me about winter up here," she said. "What should I expect?" "Snow, sometimes 6 or 7 feet deep. Temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Storms that blow through for days without breaking. Being completely isolated from October through March, no way in or out until the pass is clear." He paused, and she felt him turn his head to look down at her. "It can be beautiful and brutal in equal measure. If you feel trapped or scared or want to leave when spring comes, I will understand. This life is not for everyone." Josephine considered this seriously, weighing the reality of what she had committed to against the romantic notion of wilderness life. "I would rather be isolated with you than surrounded by people who judge me. I would rather face honest danger from weather and wildlife than the cruelty of so-called civilized society. And I would rather learn to be strong enough to survive this than spend my life being told I am somehow deficient because my hair is the wrong color." His arm tightened around her. "You are already strong enough. You just need to learn the practical skills, and I will teach you everything I know. How to read weather signs, preserve food, maintain the cabin, handle emergencies. By this time next year, you will be as competent in the mountains as any woman who grew up here." They went to bed that night with nervous anticipation replacing the previous night's awkwardness. Elijah had been patient and gentle, but Josephine could feel the want radiating from him, the careful control he exercised to give her time and space. She did not want him to wait any longer. They had made vows before God and witnesses. They had traveled to this remote cabin to build a life together, and she loved him with an intensity that had grown from spark to flame over the past week. When she began unbuttoning her dress, Elijah's hand stilled on his own shirt, his eyes going dark with desire. "Are you sure? I am your wife. I want to be your wife in every way." Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked the buttons, but her voice remained steady. "I trust you, Elijah. Show me what it means to be loved by you." He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his hands replacing hers on the buttons, his touch reverent as he helped her out of the dress. She wore only her shift beneath, thin cotton that did little to hide her form, and she watched his face as he looked at her, seeing wonder and desire and love chasing across his features. His hand skimmed over her shoulders, down her arms, mapping her body with calloused fingers that somehow felt perfect against her skin. "You are so beautiful," he said, his voice gone rough with want. "Red hair like autumn fire, skin like cream, eyes that see straight into my soul. How did I get this lucky?" Josephine helped him out of his shirt, revealing the muscled expanse of his chest and shoulders, the scars that marked a life lived rough, the raw masculine power barely contained in his large frame. She traced the line of an old injury across his ribs, and he shivered under her touch, his breath catching. They came together on the bed with gentle urgency, Elijah's patience warring with his need, Josephine's inexperience overcome by instinct and love. He took his time despite the tension thrumming through his body, making sure she felt only pleasure, whispering endearments against her skin as he showed her with actions what words could not adequately express. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath wool blankets and furs. Josephine's red hair spread across Elijah's chest like spilled copper, his arms wrapped around her as though he would never let go. She felt changed somehow, not just in the physical sense but something deeper, as though she had finally stepped into the person she was always meant to be. The unmarriageable girl from Missouri had become the beloved wife of a mountain man, and the transformation felt like coming home. Winter announced itself with the first snow 3 weeks after their arrival, fat flakes drifting down from a leaden sky to blanket the clearing in white. Josephine stood at the window watching the world transform, marveling at how the snow softened everything, turning the harsh mountain landscape into something almost gentle. Elijah came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "This is just the beginning," he said. "By January, you will be sick of snow and cold and being stuck inside." But Josephine found she did not mind the isolation nearly as much as he had warned. The cabin became their entire universe, warm and safe while storms raged outside. Elijah taught her to cook over the fireplace, to bake bread in the Dutch oven buried in coals, to prepare the game he brought home from his trap lines. She learned to recognize weather patterns in cloud formations and wind direction, to distinguish between the tracks of deer and elk and bear in the snow, to move through the cabin performing necessary tasks with the efficiency that came from practice and familiarity. They developed rhythms and routines that gave structure to days that otherwise might have blurred together. Elijah checked his trap lines, maintained the cabin, split firewood, and handled the 100 small tasks that kept them alive and comfortable. Josephine managed cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and learning to tan the hides Elijah brought home from his hunting. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Elijah carving or working leather while Josephine sewed or read from the small collection of books he owned. They talked endlessly, sharing stories from their separate pasts, planning for a future that felt more real with each passing day. Christmas came and went quietly, marked by a special meal and gifts they had made for each other. Elijah presented her with a beautiful comb carved from deer antler, the handle shaped into delicate leaves and flowers that must have taken hours of painstaking work. Josephine gave him a new shirt she had sewn from fabric he had among his supplies, sized to fit his broad shoulders and long arms, decorated with careful embroidery at the collar and cuffs. They exchanged these tokens of affection and appreciation, then made love while snow fell softly outside and the fire burned low, and Josephine thought she had never been happier in her entire life. January brought the hardest weather, storms that buried the cabin for days at a time, temperatures that dropped so low the windows frosted on the inside despite the roaring fire. Josephine learned what Elijah had meant about feeling trapped, the walls closing in when they could not safely venture outside for days on end. But even cabin fever could not diminish her love for this life they had built. She would rather be snowed in with Elijah than free to roam in a world that had never accepted her. One night during a particularly brutal blizzard, with wind screaming around the cabin and snow piling against the door, Josephine woke to find Elijah sitting up in bed, his attention focused on some sound she could not distinguish from the storm noise. She touched his arm, and he turned to her with a finger to his lips, signaling silence. Then she heard it too, a scraping sound coming from near the barn, something large moving despite the weather. Elijah slipped from bed and dressed quickly, pulling on heavy clothes and taking his rifle from its place above the door. "Stay inside," he told her quietly but firmly. "Something is after the mule or the horses, probably a bear that should be hibernating but got driven from its den somehow. I need to scare it off before it breaks into the barn." Fear clutched at Josephine's throat. "It is too dangerous. Let it take the animals if it wants them. If it kills the mule and horses, We have no way to get supplies when spring comes. No way to leave if there is an emergency. I have to protect them." He kissed her quickly, fiercely. "I will be careful. I have done this before." He disappeared out into the storm, and Josephine stood at the window straining to see anything through the driving snow. Minutes passed like hours, her imagination conjuring terrible scenarios. Then she heard the sharp crack of rifle fire. Once, twice, and her heart stopped. The silence that followed felt endless, broken only by the wind and her own ragged breathing. Finally, the door burst open and Elijah stumbled inside, covered in snow, his rifle still in his hand. It was a grizzly, probably woken early by all the storms. Got it before it could break through the barn wall. Big male, maybe 700 pounds, gave it both barrels and it went down hard. Josephine threw herself at him, shaking with relief and residual fear, holding him tight enough that he grunted. "I thought you were dead. I thought the bear had killed you." "Takes more than one angry grizzly to kill me," he said, but she could hear the shakiness in his voice that revealed the danger had been real. "But I would be lying if I said it was not close. That bear wanted those animals bad enough to brave the storm, and hungry bears are unpredictable." They stayed up the rest of the night, drinking coffee and sitting close to the fire. Elijah describing the confrontation in detail now that the immediate danger had passed. When dawn finally broke, gray and still storming, they went out together to examine the massive carcass lying in the snow outside the barn. Josephine stared at the size of the creature, the huge claws and powerful jaws, and understood just how much danger Elijah had faced to protect their livestock and livelihood. Over the next few days, Elijah butchered the bear with Josephine's help, teaching her how to process the meat and preserve the hide. The work was hard and bloody and exhausting, but it would provide resources they needed: bear fat for cooking and waterproofing, meat to supplement their winter stores, a hide that could be made into a warm robe or sold when they returned to civilization. Nothing was wasted, and Josephine felt a strange respect for the animal that had died trying to survive, even as she was grateful Elijah had been skilled and quick enough to protect them. February brought a slight warming, days when the sun actually appeared and temperatures rose above freezing. They could venture outside more easily, and Elijah took Josephine on snowshoe walks around the clearing, showing her the winter beauty of the mountains. Trees stood stark against white snow, their branches etched in ice, and animal tracks told stories of survival and hunting for those who knew how to read them. She saw where a fox had pounced on a mouse beneath the snow, where deer had scraped bark from young trees in search of food, where a mountain lion had passed through on silent paws. One afternoon during these February thaws, Josephine realized her monthly courses had not come. She had been too busy adjusting to mountain life to pay attention to such things, but now that she thought about it, she could not remember bleeding since before Christmas. Her hand went to her belly, flat still but perhaps holding the beginning of new life, and she felt joy and terror in equal measure. A baby in the mountains, far from doctors and midwives, with only Elijah's rough medical knowledge to see her through pregnancy and birth. She waited until evening to tell him, rehearsing the words in her head while she prepared dinner, trying to gauge his reaction before she had even spoken. Would he be happy? Worried? Angry that she had gotten pregnant so soon when they were still learning each other? But when she finally gathered her courage and said the words, his face transformed with pure joy. A baby. He crossed the room in a rush, pulling her into his arms with careful gentleness, his large hand spanning her waist. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor to confirm it, but I am late, and I have been feeling strange in the mornings, and I just know somehow." She looked up at him, searching his face. "Are you happy about this?" "Happy does not come close to describing what I feel." His voice broke slightly on the words, and she saw tears shining in his pale blue eyes. "You have given me so much already. Love and companionship, and a reason to want more than solitude. Now you are giving me a family. How could I be anything but overjoyed?" They held each other as darkness fell outside, talking in whispers about the future, planning for this child that would be born high in the mountains, far from the judgments and prejudices that had marked both their lives. Elijah became even more protective than before, insisting Josephine rest more and work less, hovering over her with concern that she found both touching and occasionally frustrating. But she understood the fear beneath his attention, the knowledge that childbirth killed women regularly even with medical help, and the isolation that made them dependent solely on each other and his limited skills. March brought the first real signs of spring, the snow beginning to recede from the lower elevations even as it remained thick in the high country. Elijah started planning for their trip down to Calistoga once the passes cleared. They would need to stock up on supplies before Josephine got too far along in her pregnancy to travel safely. He also began work on expanding the cabin, adding a small room that would serve as a nursery, his hands crafting a cradle from pine wood during the long evenings. One afternoon, Josephine stood in the clearing watching Elijah work on the new room addition, his shirt discarded despite the lingering chill, muscles flexing as he maneuvered heavy logs into place. She marveled at the path that had brought her to this moment, from the girl told she was unmarriageable to the woman carrying a child conceived in love. Her hand rested on her belly, still flat but beginning to feel different, and she thought about the baby growing inside her, a child who would inherit her red hair and Elijah's blue eyes, who would grow up knowing mountains and wilderness, who would never hear that their appearance made them somehow wrong or cursed. Elijah looked up and caught her watching, his face breaking into the smile that still had the power to stop her breath. He crossed to her, pulling her against his chest, his hand covering hers on her belly. "What are you thinking about? How lucky I am. How blessed. How grateful that Mrs. Henderson was wrong about everything." She tilted her face up to kiss him, tasting salt sweat and mountain air. "I was never unmarriageable. I was just waiting for the right man to see me properly." "I was never really living," he replied softly. "Just surviving, going through motions, filling time." "You showed me the difference between existing and truly being alive. Your autumn fire beauty did not just catch my eye, Josephine. It ignited something in me that I did not know was missing." They stood together in the clearing as the last snow of winter melted around them, preparing to welcome spring and the child it would bring. And Josephine knew with absolute certainty that every moment of hardship and rejection had been worth enduring to arrive at this joy. The passes cleared in early April, the mountain trails turning to mud as snowmelt rushed downhill in hundreds of streams and rivulets. Elijah decided they should make the trip to Calistoga before Josephine entered her second trimester, giving them a window of relative safety for travel. They packed the mule with furs and preserved meat to trade, loaded the horses, and began the descent from the high country. Josephine had improved dramatically as a rider over the winter, no longer needing the gentlest mount and most careful guidance. She sat her horse with confidence, navigating the muddy trail with Elijah at her side, taking in the transformation that spring brought to the mountains. Wildflowers pushed through the remaining snow, adding splashes of purple and yellow and white to the landscape. Birds returned in noisy flocks, their songs filling the air after months of winter silence. Everything felt renewed and fresh, and Josephine understood why people spoke of spring as a time of rebirth. They reached Calistoga 3 days later, the town looking smaller and more cramped than Josephine remembered after months in the wilderness. People stared at them as they rode down the main street, not with the old judgment of her hair, but with the curiosity reserved for those who chose isolation over community. She noticed how Elijah drew attention, his size and obvious strength marking him as someone not to be trifled with, his hand never far from the knife at his belt. Mrs. Callahan cried when she saw them, pulling Josephine into a fierce hug before stepping back to examine her with sharp eyes. "Mountain life agrees with you. Never seen you look so healthy and happy. And is that a glow I am detecting, or am I reading too much into things?" "You are not reading too much," Josephine confirmed, smiling at her friend's perceptiveness. "We are expecting a child in October." The older woman's eyes filled with tears again. "Oh, honey, that is wonderful news. You are going to be parents. Does this mean you will stay in town until after the baby comes? I cannot imagine giving birth up in those mountains without proper help." Elijah fielded this question, his voice gentle but firm. "We will spend a few days here getting supplies and visiting, but then we are heading back home. Josephine wants the baby born in our cabin, and I will do everything in my power to make sure both she and the child come through safely." They spent the next several days in Calistoga, trading their goods for supplies they would need before winter trapped them again. Josephine visited with the few friends she had made during her brief time in town, receiving congratulations and warnings in equal measure. Most people seemed shocked that she had not only married but married well, that the mountain man everyone knew but few understood had chosen her and treated her like precious treasure. On their last evening before returning to the mountains, they ate dinner at Mrs. Callahan's restaurant, the older woman insisting on cooking them a special meal. She brought out dishes Josephine had not tasted in months, fresh vegetables and tender beef and pie made with preserved apples, and they ate until they were stuffed. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Callahan pressed packages into their hands, supplies she insisted they would need for the baby, tiny clothes and soft blankets and bottles of medicine she swore would help with various infant ailments. "You take care of each other," she said, hugging them both fiercely. "And you send word when that baby arrives. I will worry every day until I hear that you are both safe." They promised to send word somehow, perhaps through another trapper passing through, and then they rode out of town under a moon that turned the landscape silver. Josephine felt the pull of the mountains calling her home, the cabin that had become her sanctuary, the life she had built with this extraordinary man who saw beauty where others saw only superstition. The return journey took 4 days, slowed by the heavy load of supplies and Elijah's insistence on frequent rest stops for Josephine. She found herself grateful for his care, the pregnancy beginning to assert itself through constant fatigue and occasional nausea. He tended to her with unfailing patience, making camp early when she needed rest, preparing foods that settled her uneasy stomach, holding her when morning sickness left her weak and shaking. When they finally crested the last ridge and saw the cabin waiting in its clearing, Josephine felt tears of homecoming prickling her eyes. She had been gone less than 2 weeks, but the cabin looked like everything safe and good in the world, the home where she belonged without question or judgment. Elijah helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist, and together they stood looking at the place they would raise their child. Summer passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Elijah finished the nursery addition, installing a real door and a window that could be shuttered against cold. He built furniture sized for a baby, a cradle and changing table and small chest for clothes, working the wood with such care that each piece became a work of art. Josephine sewed tiny garments and blankets, her hands creating practical items made beautiful through love and attention. They talked endlessly about names, settling finally on James if the baby was a boy and Emma if it was a girl. Names that honored no one in particular, but felt right when spoken aloud. As Josephine's belly swelled with the growing child, Elijah became almost comically protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a cooking pot, insisting she rest at the slightest sign of fatigue, hovering over her until she had to shoo him away to get anything done. But she understood the fear driving his behavior, and she loved him all the more for caring so deeply about her welfare and the baby's. The child moved inside her for the first time in June, a flutter that grew into definite kicks as summer progressed. Elijah would spend hours with his hand on her belly, feeling his child move beneath his palm, his face suffused with wonder. They made love carefully as her pregnancy advanced, Elijah terrified of hurting her or the baby until she convinced him that gentleness was all that was required. August brought intense heat even at their elevation, and Josephine spent long afternoons sitting in the shade of the porch, her hands resting on her now prominent belly, watching Elijah work on various projects around the clearing. He had built a chicken coop and acquired laying hens from a trapper passing through, providing them with fresh eggs. He expanded the garden Josephine had started in spring, planting vegetables that would mature before the first frost. He was preparing their home for a family of 3, and the evidence of his preparations surrounded them everywhere she looked. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the trees. Josephine's time was approaching, the baby sitting low and heavy, making movement difficult and sleep nearly impossible. Elijah had studied everything he could find about childbirth, interrogating every woman who passed through Calistoga during their spring visit, gathering supplies and knowledge against the moment when he would need to serve as midwife for his own child's birth. The labor began on a clear October morning, pain that started as a backache and progressed to contractions that took Josephine's breath away. Elijah stayed calm despite the fear she could see in his eyes, guiding her through the hours of increasing pain, offering water and encouragement, holding her when she needed to be held and giving her space when she needed to move. The day turned to evening and evening to night, and still the baby did not come, the labor progressing with agonizing slowness. Josephine had never known such pain existed, waves of it that crested and broke and crested again, leaving her exhausted and frightened. But Elijah's presence anchored her, his deep voice talking her through each contraction, his strong hands supporting her, his love surrounding her like armor against fear. She clung to him and bore down when he told her to bear down. And finally, as dawn light began filtering through the windows, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at the whole process. Elijah caught the baby with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he quickly checked to make sure everything was as it should be. "He is perfect," he told Josephine, his voice breaking. 10 fingers, 10 toes, strong lungs, absolutely perfect. He placed the baby on Josephine's chest, and she looked down at her son through exhausted tears. James had a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and when he stopped crying to stare up at his mother, Josephine felt her heart expand to accommodate this new, overwhelming love. Elijah delivered the afterbirth and cleaned up with surprising competence, his wilderness survival skills translating well to the practicalities of childbirth. Then he climbed into bed beside his wife and son, the 3 of them forming a unit that felt complete and whole. "You were so brave," he whispered, kissing Josephine's sweat-damp hair. "So incredibly strong. I have never been more in awe of anyone in my entire life." "We made a person," she replied, wonder in her voice as she studied their son's tiny features. "We created this perfect little human who will grow up knowing he is loved and wanted and valued for exactly who he is." James proved to be a healthy, hungry baby who kept them busy through the first difficult weeks. Josephine recovered slowly from the birth, her body healing while she learned the rhythms of caring for an infant. Elijah shouldered every task he could manage, cooking and cleaning and changing diapers without complaint, giving Josephine time to rest and bond with their son. He would walk the floor for hours when James cried, the baby looking impossibly small cradled against his father's broad chest, Elijah's deep voice singing lullabies his own mother had taught him decades ago. Winter came early that year, snow falling before Halloween, and they settled into the cabin for the long, cold months. But this isolation felt different with a baby in the house, the silence broken by James's cries and coos, and eventually his laughter. Josephine would nurse him by the fire while Elijah worked on various projects, and she marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just over a year. The unmarriageable girl with cursed red hair had become a wife and mother, beloved and cherished, living a life that would have been impossible if she had listened to the voices telling her she was wrong. James grew quickly, hitting each milestone with enthusiasm. He smiled early, laughed often, and adored his father with single-minded devotion. Elijah proved to be a natural parent, patient and playful, willing to spend hours entertaining his son with games and songs. Watching them together, Josephine felt her love for her husband deepen into something that transcended romance, a partnership forged in shared challenges and triumphs, a bond that would endure whatever life threw at them. Spring returned, and they made the journey to Calistoga again, this time with James bundled carefully for travel. Mrs. Callahan wept over the baby, declaring him the most beautiful child she had ever seen, and the townspeople who had once judged Josephine for her red hair now looked at her family with something approaching envy. She had what so many sought and few achieved, a marriage built on love and respect, a healthy child, a life filled with purpose and joy. The years passed in the rhythm of mountain seasons, winters spent snowed in, and summers working to prepare for the next cold season. James grew into a sturdy toddler, and then a curious little boy who followed his father everywhere, learning about wilderness survival from the moment he could walk. 2 years after James's birth, Josephine delivered a daughter they named Emma, who inherited her mother's red hair and her father's blue eyes, a beautiful combination that made strangers stop and stare. Elijah looked at his daughter's copper curls with the same appreciation he had shown for Josephine's, declaring her autumn fire beauty even more remarkable for being smaller and more precious. Emma proved to be fearless and determined, keeping up with her older brother despite the 2-year age difference, refusing to be left behind when adventures called. When James was 6 and Emma was 4, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise that delighted and terrified her in equal measure. This pregnancy proved more difficult than the previous 2, and Elijah insisted they spend several months in Calistoga before and after the birth, staying with Mrs. Callahan, who had become like family over the years. Their second son, Samuel, arrived in January, a winter baby born in town with a real doctor in attendance, much to Elijah's relief. They returned to the mountains when Samuel was 3 months old, their family now numbering 5. The cabin that had seemed spacious when it was just the 2 of them now filled with the chaos and joy of children. Elijah built an addition to create more sleeping space, and Josephine organized their lives with the efficiency born of necessity. She taught the children their letters and numbers, read to them from the growing collection of books Elijah brought up from town, and made sure they understood that education mattered even in the wilderness. The children grew up wild and free, learning to track animals before they learned to write their names, comfortable with silence and solitude, respectful of the power and beauty of the natural world. James became his father's shadow, learning everything Elijah could teach about hunting and trapping and survival. Emma developed her own interests, studying plants and animals with scientific curiosity, collecting specimens and asking questions that required Elijah to admit the limits of his knowledge. Samuel proved to be the gentle soul of the family, more interested in carving and crafting than hunting, his small hands creating beautiful objects from wood and stone. Josephine watched her children grow with pride and gratitude, knowing they would never face the judgments and prejudices that had defined her own childhood. Emma's red hair was celebrated rather than condemned, her fierce spirit encouraged rather than suppressed. The boys learned from their father that strength came in many forms, that gentleness and power were not mutually exclusive, that real men protected and provided without diminishing others. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Elijah surprised Josephine with a trip to Calistoga, leaving the children in the care of a trusted friend who had moved to a cabin a few miles from theirs. They stayed at the hotel where she had first lived when she arrived in town, and he took her to dinner at Mrs. Callahan's restaurant, where they sat at the same table where they had first met. "You ever regret it?" he asked, his large hand covering hers on the table. "Giving up the possibility of town life, raising our children so isolated from society, choosing hardship and work over comfort and ease." Josephine looked at this man who had loved her when she thought herself unlovable, who had seen beauty where others saw only reasons for rejection, who had built a life with her that honored both of them. His dark hair showed more silver now, and lines had deepened around his eyes and mouth, but he remained the strongest, most capable person she had ever known, and he still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. "Not for a single moment," she replied with absolute honesty. "You gave me everything I had been told I could never have. Love, family, a home, acceptance, happiness. You looked at my red hair and saw autumn fire beauty instead of a curse. That changed everything for me, Elijah. It changed who I believed I could be." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with the same reverence he had shown on their wedding day. "You changed everything for me too, made me understand that isolation was not the same as peace, that solitude could become loneliness without the right person to share it. You brought light and warmth and love into my life, and then you gave me children who are the best of both of us. How could I be anything but grateful for every moment we have had together?" They made love that night in the hotel room with the passion and tenderness that had sustained their marriage through a decade of challenges and triumphs. And Josephine thought that Unmarriageable had been the greatest lie ever told about her, because she had turned out to be not just marriageable but perfectly matched to the one man who could see her true value. The years continued their steady march, bringing changes and challenges, joys and sorrows, the full spectrum of life lived fully and without regret. They added 2 more children to their family, another daughter named Catherine, and finally a son named David, their cabin bursting with noise and activity and love. Elijah expanded their home again and again, creating space for their growing family, his hands building not just walls and rooms but a legacy of care and commitment. The children eventually grew old enough to make their own choices about where and how to live. James chose to follow his father's path, building his own cabin deeper in the mountains and living a life of wilderness isolation. Emma surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, moving to Sacramento to educate other people's children while applying the lessons she had learned in the mountains about curiosity and courage. Samuel became a craftsman whose work was sought after throughout California, his pieces commanding high prices for their beauty and quality. Catherine and David were still finding their own paths, but Josephine knew they would choose well, because they had been raised to value authenticity over approval, character over conformity. When Josephine turned 50, she and Elijah stood together in the clearing that had been their home for nearly 3 decades, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. Her red hair had faded to copper streaked with silver, but Elijah still looked at it with the same appreciation he had shown that first day in the restaurant. "Still reminds me of autumn fire," he said, running his fingers through her hair. "Maybe even more now, with the silver adding dimension like frost on oak leaves. You have spent 30 years finding ways to tell me my hair is beautiful," she replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "Do you ever get tired of it?" "Never. And I plan to spend the next 30 years continuing the tradition." He wrapped his arms around her, and they stood together as darkness claimed the valley, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary from what others had declared impossible. Josephine thought about the girl she had been, told she was unmarriageable, cursed by red hair and bad fortune, destined for loneliness and rejection. She thought about the journey that had brought her to California, and then to Calistoga, and finally to these mountains where she had discovered her true self. She thought about Elijah walking into that restaurant and seeing beauty where everyone else saw only reasons for judgment. She thought about the life they had built, the children they had raised, the love that had sustained them through 3 decades of joys and hardships. And she knew, with the certainty that came from a life fully lived, that every moment of struggle had been worth it to arrive at this happiness. The voices that had declared her unmarriageable had been proven wrong in every possible way, because she had not just married but married extraordinarily well, finding a partner who cherished her completely and built a life with her that honored them both. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Elijah turned her in his arms and kissed her with the passion and tenderness that had never diminished despite the passing years. "I love you, Josephine Turner, today, tomorrow, and for all the days we are given. Your autumn fire beauty still takes my breath away." She kissed him back, pouring 3 decades of love and gratitude into the gesture, and silently thanked whatever fate or fortune had brought them together. The mountain man and the unmarriageable woman had created something beautiful and lasting, a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And that, Josephine thought as Elijah swept her up in his strong arms and carried her toward their cabin while she laughed with pure joy, was the best possible ending to a story that had started with judgment and transformed into love. They lived out their days in those mountains they both loved, growing old together surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, visited regularly by children and eventually grandchildren who carried forward the lessons they had learned about seeing beauty in what others condemned, about having the courage to forge your own path regardless of what society demanded. And when people asked about the secret to their enduring happiness, Elijah would always smile and say the same thing. "I saw autumn fire beauty where others saw only a curse, and I was smart enough to recognize that finding such rare treasure meant holding on to it with everything I had. The rest was just choosing love, every single day, no matter what challenges came our way." Josephine would add her own perspective, her voice still strong despite the years. And I was brave enough to believe him when he said I was beautiful, to trust that one man's truth could override a lifetime of lies. That belief changed everything. Their love story became legend in Calistoga and the surrounding territories. The tale of the mountain man and the red-haired woman who proved that real love sees past superficial judgments to the precious truth beneath. And their descendants carried forward not just their names but their legacy of courage and authentic living, creating ripples of positive change that extended far beyond what either of them could have imagined that day, when Elijah Turner walked into a restaurant and saw Autumn Fire Beauty looking back at him with cautious hope in her eyes. The end.